everybody, and welcome to the Interviewing the Art and Science of Answering Tough Questions webinar. My name is Callie Nelson. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Graduate Assistant for Graduate Student and Postdoc Advising and Programs at UConn Center for Career Development at the Storrs campus. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in this webinar. You should see your attendee interface on your computer desktop in the upper left corner. You will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing your questions into the chat panel of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. Since this is a previously recorded webinar, these questions will be emailed to the center and answered within 3 to 5 business days. Note that a recording of today's webinar will be emailed to you within 24 hours. There's also a short evaluation that will appear at the end of the webinar for you to complete. Okay, so our topics today are outlining tough questions, interview prep and strategies, and then we'll also go over a couple examples. So job preparation and interview preparation. So way before the interview, you can start thinking about these things to prepare. You can get confident talking about you. Interviews obviously are a lot of talking about yourself. It can sometimes be a little bit uncomfortable to do that, especially if you're not super familiar with talking about yourself a lot. So starting to familiarize yourself with it can be really helpful before you start interviewing. There's also practicing out loud. It's one thing to read your resume over and think, well, if they ask me this question, I'll definitely know how to answer it. It's another thing when you actually try answering the question, because sometimes the way that you would answer it would be a little bit different than what you would do in your mind. So try to practice some of your things out loud, and then you'll have a better idea of what you'd actually like to do. Also, research the company and the people. Doing this will make you more prepared to know what kind of candidate the company is looking for, or the institution, and also the people. So you can get a little bit of an idea of what the culture is like in the position and what they might be looking for in a candidate. You can also review your resume. When you're interviewing, you should be prepared to answer anything of any of your past experiences. So even the one that you did a really long time ago and you don't really remember, you don't want to get caught out in a question like that and actually think, well, I don't actually remember much that happened in that position. So review your resume and start looking over things and remind yourself of some of the things that you've done in the past. It's also a good idea to look through it and think, like, this is a good example for something where I could talk about my research. This is a good example of something that went wrong in a research project. So you can get more familiar with the things that you've done. You can also review the job description and prepare to show your competencies. The job description really shows you what they're looking for in a candidate. So if they say multiple times that they're looking for somebody with leadership skills, then you can bet that they're going to ask about some questions about leadership during the interview. So rereading the job description can be helpful to see what they're really looking for in a candidate. If you wrote a cover letter and you might have mentioned some of the things in the job description, you might want to reread your cover letter as well to review some of that information. You can also clarify the type of interview and learn about with whom it will be. So types of interviews can include things like a panel interview where you have a lot of people interviewing you. You can have a group interview with a lot of other people interviewing. You can also do a virtual interview, so a Skype interview or some other type of video chat interview, or a phone interview, or a one-on-one more traditional interview. Your strategy is going to be a little bit different depending on each of these types of interviews. You wouldn't prepare the same way for a panel interview as for a phone interview. So clarify with the person who you've been working with to schedule the interview to find out what type of interview it will actually be. You can also learn about who it will be with. So if it was with a researcher or your future supervisor, you can expect that some of the questions that they'll ask you are going to be more technical and specific to the job that you'll be doing. And if you're working with somebody in human resources and HR, they're probably going to be more vague questions or more general questions about the things that are going on in the company, or general things about you and how you respond to certain situations. So you can start thinking about all those things way before you actually start the interview. So why are some questions tough? So you can be surprised by the question. Maybe you weren't expecting to answer something like that, and that can make the question difficult. You might not have practiced a response. This is one of the reasons why watching this webinar is great, so you can actually think about how you would start practicing and then maybe actually start practicing. But if you haven't practiced it, you might not be as familiar with answering it. There's also the perception that there must be one correct answer. So this comes up a lot in ethical interview questions where they say if you saw a student cheating and it's your friend, what would you do? There's a perception that there is one correct answer. And that can be difficult to answer if you feel like you're not actually giving the answer that you would like to give, or if you feel like your answer isn't what they're looking for. You can also doubt what you're saying. This has happened to me in interviews before. I get about halfway through my question or my answer, and then I realize that I'm not really sure what I'm talking about, or that I'm not sure that I understood the question, or that I'm not really confident in my response. So that can make answering questions difficult. They can also require you to think on the spot. This is why interviews can be difficult, because you can really prepare, but some of the questions can be new and they make you think on the spot. And that can be difficult for a lot of people. You can also not really understand the question, as has also happened to me, where I think that I understand the question, then again, halfway through, I start to realize that maybe I answered the wrong part, or that I didn't really understand the question in the first place. So that can be difficult. You can also have to talk about something negative. This is getting more and more common with interviews. We don't want to talk about negative things, because in interviews, we only want to talk about how great we are. But it's a strategy that a lot of people use in hiring, to talk about something that you feel that when you experience failure or a setback, or when you had a difficult situation with somebody, to see how you deal with negative situations. As much as we'd like to talk about only the good things about ourselves, you will probably encounter some negative things in your workplace and new positions. So those questions are something that can show how you deal with setbacks. So we recommend to structure your response when answering questions in interviews, to actually use the structure so you don't get lost in your answer, and have a beginning, middle, and end to your response. So here are some types of tough questions that we'll be going through this webinar. We have behavioral questions, case-based questions, ethical questions, unethical questions, and also silly questions. So behavioral interview questions. These are things like, tell me about a time when you experienced failure, or something that a time when you succeeded in something. Give me an example of how you work with a team, or how you would conduct research in this scenario. Share how your process with working with students or publishing papers. Anything that it asks you something that has happened or might happen in the future, and how you would respond to a situation like that. So you're talking about your behaviors. So the strategy with behavioral interviewing is to talk about the situation. So what is the situation? What was the thing that actually went on? The task, what did you actually have to do? The action, what is the action that you did when you were responding to this issue? And the result, what did you learn from the experience? And then relate is relating the experience to the future job. So starting with the situation and the task should be the smallest areas. Sometimes I see people putting way too much information in the situation. So they'll say like, well, in this situation, I was with my friend. Well, actually it wasn't my friend, it was my student, and then they became my friend, and then they were with their student who was in this class in environmental engineering. It's just a little bit too specific. We don't need to know that much information about it. You want to have the situation task as brief as possible, so then you can move on to what you actually did and what the result was. And that's more of what people are looking for in interviews. With the action, you also need to be careful about who you were actually, how you talk about the action, especially when you're used to working in a team or in a lab. Some people will say we a lot, but I would make sure that if you're talking about you should use pronouns like I, because that will show like that you actually did these things. If you say we a lot and you're talking about the lab, it's unclear to the person who's interviewing you whether that was actually you or if it was somebody else in the lab. And they're interviewing you and not your whole lab. So make sure to take credit for the actions that you did, and also to not put blame on other people if you're talking about something negative. And the result, what you learned from the experience. So especially with negative questions, you want to look at what you learned from the experience. So everybody experiences negative things. I have some people say like, I've never failed before. I've never had an experience that was difficult. Yes, you have. Everybody has. So, but even though you have to talk about something difficult, you should really focus on what you learned from the experience, and then tie it back to the position. So if you experience a setback in your research and you're applying for a research position, you might want to say like, this is something that has really helped me realize I needed to have more organization skills in submitting manuscripts, and this is something that I want to make sure that I do better in this position coming up. Pretty much with everything in interviewing, we recommend to tie it back to the position to really connect those dots between what you've done and what they're looking for. Sometimes it can seem like it would be intuitive, like I have these skills in researching and I'm applying for a research position, but really relating it back can make it really, really clear and make it very easy for the person who's interviewing you to decide that you're the right person for the position. So altogether, situation, task, action, result, relate, that is STARR, or the STAR method. So when you're going through your behavioral interview questions, these can also be really long questions. So this is something that can help guide you through your answer. It's also helpful sometimes, like when I do it, I get confused when I'm going through my behavioral questions and I think, okay, I just talked about the action, so then the next one is R, that's relate. So it can be helpful to use this strategy when answering behavioral interview questions. So here are some potential prompts. Look through these and maybe think about how you would answer some of them using the STAR method. So tell me about a time when you found it difficult to work with a team member. Again, this is a negative one. Failure, give me an example of a failure in your research, or share how you fixed an error that you made. Not all of these are negative, not all behavioral interview questions are negative, but it's really good to particularly prepare for the negative ones because they can be more difficult. And remember to use the STAR method. All right, so now we'll go on to case-based interview questions. These are the questions that come up in like all the thought pieces about like how things are difficult with interviewing. These are things like, why are manholes round? What would you do if like aliens attacked? Or maybe that's not a good example. How many windows are in this building? How many floors are there in the Empire State Building? Things like that. Things that you wouldn't necessarily need to know the answer for, but they're asking you anyway to see what your thought process is. So the strategy for case-based interview questions is to listen to what is being asked and paraphrase. So if they're saying, especially if this is long, sometimes with like engineering or some more like math-based statistical things, they'll have like a lot of numbers. And it's good to listen, first of all, listen so you can actually remember some of the things that you're being asked, and then paraphrase it back to them. So if you say like, okay, I'm looking at a building with 4 floors, it has 10 windows, and then they might correct you and say, well, actually it's 8 windows. So at least you're not starting on a big question or like a big answer without having like wrong information. So listen and then paraphrase the answer back to them so they can correct you if you were wrong. Think of questions which you'll need the answer. I get a lot of people when I ask these questions, like how many windows are there in a building, and they'll say, or in Wilbur Cross sometimes, let's say, and they'll say, I don't know, I didn't count them. I know you didn't count them. I know that people don't go and count windows before they enter a building, but the idea is how many, like, how would you think of answering this question? So one of the questions, so something to do, especially with this area, is think out loud. So say things like, okay, well, if I'm looking at the windows, I need to know how many floors there are. I need to know how many rooms there are in the building. I need to know if there's a basement, if there's an attic, things like that. So you're showing like you can ask some of the questions and like mention some of the questions that you need to answer. You can also try asking these questions. Sometimes they will say, people interviewing you will say, no, I can't give you that answer because they want to only give the information, like the same information to all the candidates and see how you solve the problem. But other times they will give you the information and it will show that that you ask questions. So you can try asking questions. You can also just mention like, well, I need to know the answer to these dimensions, I need to know this, and that will show how you're thinking. So take notes, especially again with a longer question. You might want to take some notes and write down the numbers that you're being asked so you don't have to ask them to repeat the question a bunch of times. Ask clarifying questions again. If you're not quite sure what they're asking, or if you're not sure about part of the question, make sure you ask and get the answers before you get too far in your answer and you realize that you don't have the information that you need. And don't make assumptions. Maybe, like I said, sometimes they don't want to give you all the information for these questions, but other times they might be just as happy to give you information if you ask about the dimensions of the building. So it's good to not make assumptions about what they're looking for and actually ask them the questions or ask more about the dimensions, and maybe you'll get more information. Propose a thoughtful approach to solving the problem. So a lot of these questions, people will ask me like, well, I don't know, I need to be somewhere within I don't know if I'll have the exact right answer. It's much more important to actually show how you would thoughtfully solve this problem, because some of these questions are semi-impossible in terms of like how many windows are in this building. Chances are that you don't actually know how many windows are in the building. You don't have all the information to find out. But if you ask questions and you talk about like, well, I need to know this many floors, I need to know this many buildings, and then I would calculate the dimensions and see how many windows there are per area, then you can calculate how many windows there are in the whole building. that's proposing a thoughtful approach and not just like, well, I'd walk around until I counted all the windows. It's good to actually talk about your thought process, because that's the point of these questions. I want to know how you think and how you approach solving questions. Is it something that's thoughtful, or is it something that's a little bit more not as on target for what they're looking for? Think out loud. This is a really important one. Like I said, they really want to know your thought process. So if they ask you how many windows there are in the building that you're in, and you just say, huh, like probably 30, that doesn't really help me know anything about your thought process. So I don't know how you came to that. I don't know how you estimated. Even if it is exactly right and there are exactly 30 windows, I still don't know anything more about your thought process. So it's kind of like in math back in the day when people would say to show your work. It's the same type of thing. Show your work and how you get to the answer, so they can actually have more of an idea about how you solve these problems. And that's really the point of these case-based interview questions, is to see how you approach solving problems. Also step back once more and get a big picture of the issue. I see sometimes with students, they'll say things like, well, I need to know what the shape of the windows are. I need to know what type of, if they're like, what type of architecture is in the building, and get a little bit focused on something that might not be as needed as some other parts of the answer. So it can be helpful to step back and make sure that you're answering the question on point, and make sure that you have the big picture idea of the issue. And then at the end, you should summarize your conclusions and provide an answer. This is another question that I get a lot. Do I actually have to answer these questions? Yes, you are expected to actually answer. It doesn't have to be correct. People usually aren't looking for an exact answer for how many windows are in the building, but they do want to know, is your answer something that's within the general area? So for windows of a building that's like 4 floors high, let's talk about Wilbur Cross. If you say 2 windows, that's really under. And if you say 2,000 windows, that's probably way too many windows. So as long as you have an answer that's kind of in the realm of possibilities, so maybe 200 windows, I'm actually not sure how many windows there are in Wilbur Cross, but if you estimate something that is reasonable and show your work, that's usually what companies and other positions are looking for. So here's one that you can think about. How many ping pong balls would fit in this room? So I've asked this question to people before, and some good answers that I've heard, or some good questions that they'd ask would be, is the furniture in the room or not? And I need to know that the diameter of this, or the circumference of the ping pong balls. I need to know the dimensions of the room, things like that. And then proceed with solving the problem. Something, again, like maybe 50 ping pong balls in a standard office room is probably a little bit too little, but 2 million is probably way too many. So something more in a more reasonable area is what they're looking for. All right, and then moving along to ethical interview questions. So these are questions that are getting more and more common, and they're especially common in social service areas, education areas, things like that. So what would you do if you saw a student cheating on an exam? What's the importance of diversity in the workplace? Describe a time when you had an ethical issue with one of your coworkers, or describe a time when you saw something unethical happen at work. Those are examples of ethical interview questions. So these are some of the potential, actually we'll go here first. So here's the strategy. So something that you can do is to research the mission, ethical values of the program and include related examples. So this is where the research of the company and the institution is really helpful. If you don't actually know what their mission statement is, or if you don't know what they're especially interested in, you might not have as much information with how to guide your response. So if they say in their mission statement that diversity is really important to them, then you might want to focus on that with some of your answers. Also include reasons why ethics are important. You can assume that when you're answering questions like, I don't want a student, it's important for students not to cheat on exams. But it's a little bit stronger if you say like, these are the reasons why it's important to not cheat on exams to improve scholarship. So actually talking about why the ethics are important can make your answer a lot stronger. And then relate your answers to specific experiences. So these are some things that you've experienced in your past. That will make your answer stronger as well. And then also showcase some moral and ethical values that you possess. So if you can say things like, it's really important to me to encourage diversity in the workplace, and I try to make sure that my coworkers' voices are heard. Those are things that can show examples of your ethics and your morals in the workplace. You can also describe the solving skills that you use in judgments. So this is again kind of like thinking out loud. Like, well, it's really important in education to not have somebody cheat on something. It's really important to have diversity in the workplace. I would try to consider their background and what other people are experiencing, and then use those things to move forward with your answer. So really describing some of the skills that you use in making actual judgments. And then use the STAR method for answering behavioral ethical questions. So those are things like, again, if you see a student cheating, what do you do? That's a behavioral question. It just has an ethical spin. So you can still use the STAR method with that one as well. So then here are some actual ethical questions that you can think about. So if you noticed a student cheating on an exam in your class, what would you do? What current events affect how you would do your job? What is the importance of ethical codes in the workplace? And describe a time when you worked with a person or a group whose background, values, beliefs were different from your own. So a lot of these, at least, especially the last one and the first one, those are behavioral questions. So that's where you can use the STAR method. And then the other two can be helpful to know more about the morals of the company, to understand like how you would answer those questions. So think about those ethical questions and think about how you would answer them, and then you can also start practicing your techniques. Now we will go to unethical interview questions. So these are called unethical interview questions. Things like, are you going to move with your partner? Who is going to move with you? Are you planning on having kids in your next job? So these are not necessarily unethical questions. A lot of people say that they're illegal because it can set the company or the institution up for a discrimination lawsuit, and that they can't ask these questions. Interviewers actually can ask these questions. In any case, they're inappropriate either way, but they can actually ask whatever questions they want. So it's important to be prepared for some of these questions, even though they are extremely inappropriate. So the strategy for this is to decide beforehand what information you want to keep personal. If you're completely fine with revealing some parts of yourself, such as how many kids you have, or you feel like this is something that you want to mention in your interview, then that's completely fine. Something that might be totally fine for somebody to mention, they might be completely happy with that, with answering whatever question, then you might not be as okay with using some information in these questions. So it's really important to think about the actual information that you're okay with sharing in interviews, so that you're not caught off guard and then maybe answer more than you'd like to. You can also redirect the focus back to you and your qualifications. You can say something like, this is something that happens a lot with unethical questions. I've heard of people saying like, people can be a little bit sneaky about asking questions. So I've heard of somebody who was interviewing somebody else, and they said they had pictures of their kids on their desk. They said like, oh, look how cute my kids are. Do you have kids? So they'll kind of set it up as like an innocuous thing, then they'll spin it into an unethical question on you. So to deal with a situation like that, you can really start by redirecting the focus back to you. So you can say like, wow, your kids are really cute. I'd prefer to focus more on my qualifications for this position. You could also say, I'd prefer not to answer that question, and then spin it right back to, and then I would love to talk more about my research project in this area. So as soon as you can redirect the focus, that can really help you in moving forward from these questions. You can also comment on the interviews and information without revealing your own. That kind of came up earlier when I talked about the sneaky questions, with saying like, these are my kids on my desk. Do you have kids? You can say something like, oh, your kids are really cute. I'd like to move forward with the question about my research. So that is not saying like, well, your kids are terrible and I don't want to talk about kids at all. So you can still respond to the question without revealing any information of your own. You can also state that you would not like to answer the question, then move back to your qualifications. So you can really say like, that's not something that I'm comfortable answering, but I would be happy to talk more about my qualifications in research or teaching. These questions are definitely difficult and they're inappropriate in any way, but it can be helpful to be prepared in case you get into these situations. I've also had people ask me if they shouldn't take a job if somebody asks them any of these questions. That's also something that would be really personal. Maybe you're okay with taking a position with somebody, or if that person is going to be your supervisor and you don't feel comfortable with them after that, that is going to be completely up to you, and it's going to depend on how you feel and how comfortable you are with the situation, but that there is no like hard rule on that. So here are some other unethical interview prompts. So things like, are you planning on starting a family? Who's going to relocate with you? What does your partner do for a living? Do you have any kids? So maybe think about how you would answer some of those questions and remember to use some of the strategies that we talked about. So now we're moving on to silly interview questions. So these are questions like, what kind of animal would you be? What's your favorite color? Or what's your favorite type of cereal? If you were a superhero, what superpower would you have? These are supposed to be really light, fun questions to kind of like dispel the mood of like some of the tense parts of interviewing, but they can also be a little bit off-putting if you're not expecting it. So the main thing to do with these silly questions is to stay calm. These are supposed to be fun questions. They're usually trying to like make it a fun mood or try to show that the company is fun. So it's not meant to throw you off your game, especially if you're talking about something like pretty serious about like your research or something like that. And then they ask you like what kind of animal you would be. It can be a little bit disorienting, but the first thing to do is stay calm. They really are trying to make this fun, but it can still make it a little bit difficult. So here are some strategies for it. One thing is to keep it light. This isn't the time to say like, if you were a flower, I would be a dark rose because it really matches my personality. That's not really what they're looking for. They want it to be more of like something fun, something light. So try to keep it as light as you can. You can also relate it back to the position, your positive qualities if you can. These are kind of like for bonus points. So one thing that I've heard really, a good answer that I've heard was somebody who's in psychology, and they said, they were asked a superhero question. They said, I'd like to speak all languages because it's really important for me to communicate with people. So that's something that would be important in their position. And it's also something that's good and special about them. And they were able to bring that up in the silly question. So that's, if you can do that, that's really, really good. Try to keep your answers relatable too. I know a colleague who, when she was interviewing for a position, this was in grad school, she was asked what kind of kitchen utensil would you be? And she said, I would be a spatula so that I can scrape the mold out of the back of my fridge. And the interviewer after that was completely stuck on the mold in the fridge. And she was like, why do you have mold in the fridge? And the person was saying like, well, everybody has mold in their fridge, right? And the interviewer was like, I don't have mold in my fridge. Why are you talking about this? And then she was just like really stuck on the fact that this person had mold in her fridge. So that's not really what you want to reveal during an interview. So try to keep your answers a little bit more relatable. Here are some prompts. What superpower would you have? What kind of cereal would you be? What animal would you be? What Harry Potter character would you be? I've had at least 2 of these or 3 of these in actual interviews. So they come up a little bit more frequently than you might expect. Another thing to mention is something that I lovingly call the franchise problem, which is something like, what Harry Potter character would you be? You might not know anything about Harry Potter. So this happened to me when I was starting a new job. The orientation was all built off of Friends. So everything was related to Friends. I actually haven't seen anything about Friends. I don't know anything about the show. So if they asked me what Friends character would you be, I'd be like, I think there's somebody named Rachel, maybe. And that's really all I could say because I have no idea. But they were trying to make it fun. It was supposed to be a fun thing. I just happen to not be familiar with that franchise. So if you get a question about Harry Potter and you don't know what it is, a good thing to do can say like, you can say something like, well, I'm actually not really familiar with Harry Potter, but I can tell you what Star Wars character I would be. You can actually answer a question that way. They're also probably asking these questions because they like whatever franchise or whatever show, movie, whatever they're asking you. So they're probably asking Harry Potter because they like Harry Potter. So I wouldn't say something like, well, Harry Potter is terrible and I would never read anything about it and I have no idea about Harry Potter. It's better to just move on and say like, I actually don't know about Harry Potter. Can I answer about the Star Wars? Can I answer what Star Wars character I would be instead? So those are some prompts for some strategies for silly interview questions. And now that kind of pretty much concludes the content portion of this webinar. So this is Big Interview, which is a resource that we have at the Center for Career Development for UConn students. And it allows you to record yourself answering some questions. So again, the beginning when I said to practice and actually practicing out loud can be really helpful. If you want to do that virtually, where you're really talking yourself to you're talking about yourself to a computer, that's something you can do on Big Interview. We also have a bunch of prompts for different types of interviews. So we have like an academic interview set of questions. We have an ethical set of questions. So you can go in and answer those questions and then record yourself and then watch it back and see if there's anything that you would like to change. You can also schedule career coaching appointments to go over interview strategies or also to do a practice interview. So this wraps up the Interviewing the Art and Science of Answering Tough Questions webinar. Please consider booking an appointment with the Center for Career Development to further develop your career plans, and know that we are available to help as you explore and pursue options. As a final note, you will be emailed a recording of this webinar in the next 24 hours, and a brief evaluation will pop up at the end of the webinar. Thank you for listening, and all the best as you continue on your career journey.